Thanks for tuning in here. And we just wanted to put together just some best practices to help you navigate some of the changes that have been going on. This recording is as of August 2024. I am sure some additional changes will be coming along, but my name is Chris Cox, and I am a real estate broker here with Real Broker, working in the Raleigh Triangle area as well as the coast. And I am here with Diane Florio. Diane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, welcome. This is Diane Florio, and I also am a broker with Real Broker, also in the Triangle area, as well as working on our southern coastal areas. And as Chris said, we just want to prepare and provide something that may hopefully be a blueprint and a guideline around some best practices as we adjust to our new worlds.
Our new world, right? So yeah, so we put together 12 scenarios. Again, this is as of what we've seen, some best practices based on lots of conversations we've had with different brokers and different firms, and with guidance presented by the North Carolina Association of Realtors and just from our firms in general. So strong disclaimer here at the beginning. We are presenting this not as members of the North Carolina Real Estate Commission, although we are both approved instructors. We are not presenting this information in that role. We are also not presenting this as any from the North Carolina Association of Realtors, other than referencing some of the resources they have put out there. And please, with all of the stuff that we put together here, be sure to check with your broker in charge and your firm specific policies. So
Yes,
that being said, just a,
sorry,
yeah,
we are just
no,
merely doing this as two agents out here wanting to help each other all through this journey and
yep,
having our instructor background, we just thought this might be a way to help everybody along. So yeah, so go ahead,
yeah.
Chris.
So yeah, I just want to put together some kind of just a baseline, some three principles to remember through all of these changes. And I will admit I did borrow these from the president of Real, and just some of the stuff that he has been putting together for the real estate industry, really since the settlement was introduced in mid-March. And just three things to kind of remember as we go through all of these scenarios. These are really the three ruling principles of all of these scenarios. So number one is that there are three agreements that are part of the real estate transaction, especially for all of these scenarios. Principle number two is that there are four ways buyer agent compensation can be paid. And then number three, and this is the most important thing, is that these are just different routes to get to the same place. So just a little bit about all of these. The three agreements are the listing agreement, and this is important because this is, again, thinking of the contracts themselves. The listing agreement is a contract between the seller and the listing firm. The buyer agency agreement is between the buyer and the buyer firm. And then the purchase agreement is between the seller and the buyer. And where that becomes important is I have already seen scenarios where brokers are trying to put their compensation into additional provisions or into addendums that are attached to the offer to purchase. And that is if there's one thing I think that everybody can agree on, that is an absolute no-no as North Carolina rules license law stands right now. We are not a party to the purchase contract. That is between the seller and the buyer. Anything you want to add on that, Diane?
Nope, I think that's clear.
All right,
Yep, yeah,
awesome.
separate and apart.
And then the next thing, and we're going to talk about each one of these scenarios in different ways. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there are four different ways in which buyer agent compensation, which is at the core of all of this, can be paid. It's either going to be paid by, number one, it's the seller paid. It's going to be paid by the buyer as a second option, some combination of there, which is your hybrid paid, where the seller's paying some and the buyer's paying some. And then the fourth one, which would be similar to seller paid, which is seller concessions. But we're going to talk about kind of some different scenarios for each one of those. So those are four ways. Again, even as you think of other scenarios outside of these 12 that we have outlined for you, and there are 100 different scenarios, probably unlimited number of scenarios that could come out of the world that we're in right now. But these are essentially the four ways that a buyer agent can receive compensation and get paid through a transaction. And then the final point is just, again, we are all trying to navigate this as best as we can together. And these are ultimately just different routes to get to the same destination. We want to get from our parties to the transaction, whether we're representing the sellers or the buyer, to that closing table, and be able to get paid for the hard work that we are putting in.
Yeah,
So
and just on that note, Chris, I would
yeah,
say, we, as you said, we're all in the same boat. We have our, our agency and our fiduciary to our respective clients, though, as Sharon has said multiple times, we all just need to lead with grace, be kind, and work this through as best together as we can, as we're all learning some new territory, new destinations, and even some new language.
yeah, some new language, some new forms that we've
New
never really had to
practices.
put into. Yeah, so we're all learning this together, and that's, again, like we said, if one person watches this video and learns something from it, then I feel like we have done our part to make the real estate community a better place. So
Mhm.
with all of those ground rules in place, let's go right into the scenario. So we've got scenario number one. Go ahead, Diane, take this one away.
Okay, so scenario number one is probably the one that looks most familiar to many of us because it's a lot of what we may already have been doing, where we have, and this is based on being a listing agent. So these first set of scenarios are going to be directed at you as a listing agent and what might you need to do. So in scenario one, when your seller is offering cooperative compensation and it's offered by the firm, which is what many of us have been familiar with, and it is still an option as best we know now in North Carolina, we still can see that cooperative compensation. As Chris said, though, check with your firms, your brokerages, your BICs as to what practice you're going to move forward with. Regardless, on your listing agreement, this is where you will have negotiated what that rate will be, and you see that put in there for the firm's compensation. That will be the total, and then there's going to be a portion of that that will be delivered to the buyer agent for the work of bringing a ready, willing, and able buyer to the table and being the procuring cost. So that's where you'll see that, right? You got your 6% and your 3% situation where that could play out. So all looks similar, same old, right? In scenario one, however, we do have this added form that many of us are now hopefully becoming increasingly familiar with, and this is Form 220. The Form 220 is now becoming the document that is solidifying whatever that compensation is going to be and look like. And right now we're talking about a firm cooperative compensation. So on Form 220, you would then fill in who the seller is, what property address you are dealing with. You'd check with your seller that the listing firm is paying the selling firm, and then you would check that first box of what that's going to look like. Is it a whatever box it's going to be, right? Gross sales, or if it's a flat fee or some other type of offering. But this is how you would proceed with Form 220 when cooperative compensation is coming by the firm. And then to that end, you would then have everybody sign off on this. The seller would sign and the agent signs it more as an acknowledgement that everybody's on the same page and we understand whom and from where the compensation is going to be coming. So a best practice that we've heard and seen is that everyone should sign the Form 220, the agent involved and your sellers that are associated with that home.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so that's scenario number one. I am going to move into scenario number two, and this is a little bit different than many of us have maybe been practicing in our businesses up until now, and I think it is one that you will see. You're seeing growing momentum around this scenario. So this is, instead of putting, this is seller directed offer of buyer agent compensation. So with this scenario, we're saying that every single offer is going to get the same offer of buyer agent compensation, regardless of what the terms of that offer are. And the seller is directing that and agreeing to that in advance. So in this scenario, different from that first scenario, instead of the 6%, we are just putting what the total firm fee here is on that, and that is going to be 3%. Then, so that's section 7 of the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Then
Your
instead of,
negotiated firm amount, make sure,
yes,
right?
your
Everything's
negotiated amount.
negotiable,
Yes,
right?
yes, everything is, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for checking me on that. Yes, you negotiated 3. And then the difference here is on paragraph number 8, instead of the negotiated amount of 3%, you're putting that they are not, that the firm is not cooperating with offering any amount of that 3% as buyer agent compensation. Instead of doing that, they are going to sign Form 220 that is going to say that the seller is paying that negotiated amount of 3%. In this case, it could be a flat fee as well. In this example, though, we are using 3%, and they are checking off that the seller is paying the cooperating compensation of 3%, not the listing firm. So that's the big difference between the two there, is instead of it coming from the listing firm's portion, it is coming directly from the seller. So just those two little changes there to make this work. And then again, as Diane mentioned in scenario number 1, what we're hearing from our conversations is best practice, and this is coming from a document that the North Carolina Association of Realtors put out for best practices on this form, which I will reference several times in today's discussion, is they recommend that all parties are signing Form 220, whether it's seller offered or listing firm offered, just as a best practice. Again, just for clarity around the fact that everybody is agreeing to this is how it is going to be distributed.
Oh,
All right, scenario number 3, Diane, you got this one.
Okay, so scenario number 3 is where the seller is negotiating the buyer agent compensation based on the offer terms. So when you're preparing an offer as a buyer agent and submitting that forward, and the seller, when you're working with your seller as a listing agent, your seller may choose to say, you know what, I don't want to have any hard and fast, any kind of numbers. I don't want to pre-decide anything when it comes to an offer. I am willing to make an offer of compensation, though. I just don't know what that's going to look like until I see the offers that come and are presented to me. So that's what this scenario is. So in your listing agreement, Form 101, it's going to look just like before, right? The firm has some agreed upon service fee and or percentage that you're going to pay to your listing agent for the services provided. And then you're going to have that 0 filled in because the firm is not passing on or passing through any portion of that. It's gonna still be seller directed, but at this point in time, it's not a known number or percentage or fee that the buyer agent might be getting. So when that's the case, there is no need for a pre-sign or to have any Form 220 already in place because, again, it's negotiable based on the terms of the offer. And we're going to talk more later on about how that's going to look from the buyer side, what you would need to be doing. But right now, we're just talking about a listing agent, the documents you might need to prepare based on what scenario your seller is choosing to do when it comes to compensating buyer agents. So you may have your seller, you may have language like things saying like, I seller, I'm open to paying a buyer agent compensation based on the terms of the offer. And as a buyer agent, when you're in this space, this might be the way you might hear things over the phone or email or however you are interacting with that listing agent and or the seller directly, depends. But you're going to hear something like this, like, I'm open. It's just going to be based on what offer terms come my way.
Yeah, and just for clarity on this too, I want to be super clear on this. I think this is something that, even though there's a lot of confusion out there, this is not in the MLS. So even though there's quotes there, this is not going into the MLS at all. Just to be very clear on that. Like, this is what you may hear if you call a listing agent and you ask the question, hey, is the seller paying any buyer agent compensation on this property?
Yeah, that's just a great reminder, Chris. And we should probably remind, nothing, no word, no language, no cute ways, no anything, nothing to do with compensation and or the word commission. That's a word many of us have to erase from our vocabulary and start replacing with compensation.
Absolutely. So those are the first three scenarios for your listing agreement documentation. Again, these first set all in the blue. These are kind of on the seller represented side of the transaction. I'm going to move into scenario number 4, and this is you are again the listing agent on a property, and you get either a sign call or a website call on your listing, and the customer on the phone says they do not have an agent, but they want to see that house. So in this scenario, you can show them the house. No buyer agency agreement is required to show them the house. You would want to have them sign the working with real estate agents buyer's version and check off the box unrepresented buyer. And the agent who gave you this form may assist you in your purchase, but you will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent the seller. So that's all you need for this scenario. Pretty straightforward. And we want to just make sure that, again, this scenario, this is what you would want to have signed.
Mhm.
Scenario number 5, go ahead and take it away, Diane.
Yeah, okay, so this scenario is you are now hosting an open house for a listing that's with your firm. So for example, right, Chris and I were with Real Broker, and if Chris had a listing out there and I raised my hand and said, Chris, I'd love to host an open house for your property, then this is what this would look like. I'd be hosting, I'd be opening the door. I am a sub agent, taking you back to your pre-licensed days, and I would need to have any signed buyer agency agreements with those who come to visit the property during that open house tour. I would still want the WWREA needs to be there, just as Chris described, that you would fill it out, that they are unrepresented buyers at this time, should we move into some first substantial contact conversation. But bottom line, you don't need the buyer agency agreements when you are hosting an open house for any property that's in your firm.
So that's a big clarifying point there. So again, those first, you're all technically agents of the seller, those first 5 scenarios there. Now we are going to transition into where you are now on the buyer side of the agencies. So scenario number 6 is you are hosting an open house that is not a listing with your firm. So if let's just say, there's a listing in your neighborhood, you really wanted to host an open house, it's listed by another firm, and they are okay with that scenario, and everybody is allowing that scenario to take place. It does need to be done a little differently than scenario number 5. So in this scenario, every visitor to that open house is going to need to sign a working with real estate agents and a buyer agency agreement in one form or another. If you're using the North Carolina Association of Realtor forms, that would either be Form 201, which is the exclusive buyer agency agreement, or, which I have highlighted on the screen here, Form 203, the non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. And I just put how you would fill that out there. That would be the specific date of which the open house was. If you were just doing a non-exclusive, I just highlighted this one because it's one that many people have maybe not ever seen, even though it has been out there. In this case, you are specifically saying, hey, we're just showing the following specific property. And if you're hosting the open house at 123 Dream Home Lane, that would be identified in there under the property section. And then if it's just for them to get in the door of this open house, you would just have it be for that one day. And then in this scenario here, you also want to fill out the compensation of the firm. And that in this case, if they were to buy that specific property under this non-exclusive buyer agency agreement, the firm would be seeking 3% compensation from either the cooperating seller or the listing firm. Mm-hmm. So that is scenario number 6. Diane, take us to scenario number 7. So as we move into more of your buyers want to put in offers on properties.
Yeah, and I don't know. I just want to say in 6, just as again, we just try to put some disclaimers. Your firm, your brokerage, whatever, may have some other types of ways they're going to do these showing agreements and showing tours and things of that nature. So again, just reference what your practices are, but in general, these are some rules of thumb and the likely 2 many of us will be using.
Yes, a great point there, especially with that there are firms out there that have developed one property touring agreements, 7-day touring agreements,
Mhm,
all that kind of stuff. These are the two North Carolina Association of Realtor approved forms.
mhm. Correct.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. All
Awesome.
right, scenario
Okay.
7.
All right. Scenario 7, right? So now you're a buyer agent and you are scheduling a showing for your client. And in that process, you say, "Hey, are you offering any compensation?" And they say, "Well, my fact we are. Here is our Form 220. It's already been signed by the seller and the broker as we've been guiding on some best practice. And now your buyer wants to put an offer forward on this property." So this works under the scenario that your buyer agency agreement is the same as what's being offered. So if your BA agreement said, "I'm getting 3% as a buyer agent compensation," and the seller is offering 3% buyer agent compensation, all status quo. That's all you need to do. You sign the Form 220, and there's nothing actually more to do here except get your
That's
offer
all.
accepted.
That's it. Get it accepted. So as you see here, we've got the Form 220, and you just put in the buyer, and everybody signed it there.
Yep.
All right. On to scenario number 8. So similar scenario, you schedule a showing on a property, and the listing agent sends over Form 220 signed by the seller and the listing broker. The buyer wants to put in an offer on this property, and you see that this is offering 2%, and that is different, in this case, lower than what is offered. But you really love these buyers, and you want them to be able to get that house without putting up any additional friction into the transaction. In that case, you are going to do two different things. So in that scenario, we've got, in this scenario here, you're going to sign Form 220. So everybody's going to sign that, saying that you're good with 2%. But because your buyer agency agreement says that you are entitled to 3%, and you're not going to seek that. So if it's different than what is being offered by the seller, you do need to fill out Form 220. And additionally, Form 710, which is the agency agreement renewal or amendment. And in this one, you will fill out the top with the client name, your firm. You'll check off Form 201 or 203 if that was the one you used, or other agency agreement down there. You'll put the date of the original agreement, and then under Section 2 of Form 710, there is no specific spot to change the compensation specifically, as this form exists in August of 2024. Instead, you're going to put it under other amendments, and you're going to put in compensation of firm shall be changed from 3% to 2%. So the combination of those two things keeps you in compliance with the settlement terms, as well as the 220 that has been offered to you. So that is scenario number 8. Diane, take us into scenario number 9.
All right. So number 9 is, again, you've scheduled a showing. The listing agent sends over Form 220. It's been signed by the seller, the broker, again, the seller, the listing, and the listing agent. And your buyer, again, wants to proceed with an offer. In this scenario, though, not only are they offering compensation in the form of a gross sale, they're also offering a bonus, which sometimes many of us have seen, sometimes on resales, oftentimes in new construction, right? If you can get under contract by X date, we're going to give an additional bonus to you as a buyer agent. So this is that situation. So you see here that on the Form 220, you would see that there's the gross sale plus the other would be the bonus being offered. Okay. And the sellers have pre-signed this. Okay. In that case, then you would have your buyers, and you as the buyer agent, you would sign the Form 220. So that's one thing you need to do. And then you're going to use Form 770, which is disclosure of compensation. So now we need to fill out that with the information of the property address that you're putting the offer on. The buyer, in your case, you have the buyer, so you're the buyer agent, and the firm you're with. And then you would be saying in this disclosure that we're going to get the 3%, and then we're getting an additional bonus of $5,000 coming from the seller.
So those are kind of the 3 different scenarios that we're kind of dealing around, that offer of compensation that the seller is giving you ahead of time. So I'm going to
Yep.
move into scenario number 10. And if you remember back to that little grid that we had, that little quadrant that we had back in the beginning with the 4 ways that a buyer agent compensation can be paid, now we're getting into a couple more specific scenarios around some of the other ones. So a lot of those other ones were up till now have all been seller paid. Now we're going to move into some different scenarios. So in scenario number 10, you schedule a showing with a property. Neither the seller or the listing firm are offering buyer agent compensation. Buyer wants to put in an offer and they are going to pay the buyer agent commission at closing. Maybe this is an investor that is getting, they feel like they're getting a great deal on that property and they just want to pay you what you've agreed to on your buyer agency agreement. So as long as there's no changes in this scenario, no form changes are needed. You will just want to get a copy of the buyer agency agreement over to the lender and the closing, if there is a lender on the property, and to the closing attorney. And that will show up as a line item on the closing disclosure as a buyer paid closing cost.
It would be a debit on the buyer.
Yep. So that'll increase their closing costs on that specific property, and you will get your compensation that is in your buyer agency agreement. So that's scenario number 10. And then we've got 3 different scenarios here for scenario 11A, B, and C. So why don't you get us started with 11A?
Sure. So as Chris said, we're moving into some other scenarios outside of seller paid options. Now we're into something called seller concessions, where I think most of us are familiar with concessions in the form of, looking for repairs or costs to cover things that may have come out of an inspection and so forth. Now we're looking at the seller concessions, where it may also be a place where we may see our agency compensation being baked into an offer in that sense. That would be the place you could add in if there's a compensation to be had and you want to pull it out and get it from a seller from the concession side. We'll talk about how that shows up in your offer form. But first, this is the scenario, right? And so long as, again, everything is equal to what's on your buyer agency agreement and what that compensation is going to look like on a concession. So for example, I know we keep saying 3%, but whatever, if it says 2.4%, 2.5%, whatever your buyer agency agreement says, and the house is $500,000, just trying to make simple math because I can only do simple math. Then you would be saying, okay, buyer, let's see if we can ask for, what was that, 15,000, right? In a seller concession that would cover this buyer agency compensation. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. And if you were to do that, then this is your offer to purchase and contract. And in that section there, it says, seller to pay at settlement, pay buyer expenses, and that's where it will show you that amount. In this case, 10,000. So maybe the house was a little less than what I said.
A little less than 500. Yeah.
Anyhow, but yeah, so that's what you're filling in there.
Yeah. So just a little clarity on that too. Of course, check with your lender if they are using financing on the specifics of, is this going to be allowed in there as a way to pay that buyer agent compensation? My understanding from, again, many conversations on this is that most forms of financing have allowed for seller paid concessions to buyer agent compensation to not affect the maximum amounts of seller concessions.
Yes, that's very true.
Yes.
Great.
All right. 11B. So in this scenario, again, neither the selling agent, the seller, or the listing firm are offering a buyer agent compensation. Buyer wants to put in an offer and include seller paid buyer expenses. And then in this scenario, your buyer agency agreement is different than what that amount of the seller concession would be. You are not changing your buyer agency agreement, so no form changes are needed. You will just include the seller paid buyer expense on the offer to purchase, and then the buyer will pay the difference as a closing cost on the closing disclosure. So let's just say, again, in this scenario, we've got a $500,000 house, and it is 3%. Again, that's $15,000, and they are asking for that $10,000 closing costs credit, and 10,000 of that is going towards that. Now there's a difference of $5,000. The buyer is going to pay that, which is now why this becomes a hybrid paid, because the seller is paying $10,000 in concessions and the buyer is paying $5,000 in closing costs on that. So that is scenario 11B. And then Diane,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
say, I know we're talking that, but the scenario B could also play out with the seller is going to pay less than what you had expected or was negotiated with your buyer agency agreement. So you have 3% and the seller's paying 2%. I think we already covered that, right? But then the gap, if you choose not to make any changes and your buyer is still okay with the 3%, then you'd be getting the 2% from the seller and the 1% coming from your buyer client. So that could also become a hybrid scenario.
Yep. Yeah. So both of those are the hybrid scenario. You're absolutely right. Okay. And then we move into 11C.
All right. So 11.
Yeah. This one's yours,
11C.
Diane, I think.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I think so. Sorry. Okay. So you schedule a showing. Again, neither seller or listing firms offering any compensation over to the buyer agent. Your buyer wants an offer put in and you want to include seller paid buyer expenses, just as we've been talking about, in the form of a seller concession, but it is different than what is on your buyer agency contract and agreement. And so this is where you're going to need to make an adjustment to the buyer agency agreement. So you'll have to use that form 710 to amend. So anytime you need to make an adjustment to what you've negotiated and agreed to on your buyer agency compensation, you need to use 710 to acknowledge whatever that adjustment or change is going to be. So in this case, we're getting less than what we had talked about, but we need to amend and add to that. Right? Or did I?
Yep. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yep.
All right. And then, and so it'll look like this, right? The compensation firm shall be changed. Instead, in this case, we ask for a percentage of the sale, but that's not what we're getting. We're doing a concession dollar amount. Then we have to change the language and say we are amending it from 3% to now a $10,000 amount coming out of concessions paid by the seller.
So that's just changing it from a percentage to a flat dollar amount. And in this case, it's covered. Yeah. Yep.
Right.
So that's the big takeaways there. And on all three of those scenarios, or any of these scenarios, are anytime you are changing the amount, if you are accepting an amount that is different than what is on your buyer agency agreement, you need to amend the buyer agency agreement with Form 710.
And that amount could be more or less. So any change in that agreement.
Yep. All right. So now we're going to get into scenario 12 here. So this one, I am going to superstar asterisk disclaimer on this one. This is based on guidance provided by North Carolina Association of Realtors best practices for Form 220, which is a form you out to the website and find that form. If you just put it in the search bar and just look for Form 220 best practices, you will see these two scenarios are going to be described in bullet point or numbers 10 and 11 of that best practices. But in this scenario, the amount offered on Form 220 is either less than what your buyer agency agreement, or you're just simply told from one of Diane's earlier scenarios that it is negotiable. In this case, you as the buyer broker are going to be initiating Form 220. So, or initiating a new Form 220. So in this scenario, we'll just say you talk to Diane, Diane tells you that buyer agent seller is open to paying a buyer agent compensation based on the terms of the offer. So in this case, you're going to have a buyer initiated or buyer agent initiated Form 220. So you're going to say the property, you're going to say the gross, that what we are requesting is 3% seller paid, and you're going to have your buyer and yourself sign Form 220. Then you are going to do one of two options from there. So you are either going to, and again, this is from Number 10 in that best practices, you are going to send Form 220 in the same email, not merged together. Do not merge them as one PDF. You're going to have Form 220. You're going to have your offer to purchase separately in that same email. You're going to have Form 220 complete. Yes, 2 PDFs. I want to clarify, like, just be clear on that. They are 2 separate documents, not attached, not merged. I mean, not together as one document. You're going to have Form 220 completed on your side, and from North Carolina Association of Realtors recommendations, you're going to send the offer unsigned. And then if the seller were to agree to the terms of both the 220 and the terms of the offer to purchase, then the buyer signs it after the seller has signed it. Now, I know this is, again, this is where it's going to be super asterisk checked with your firm. Is that going to be allowable? Because it's really not much more than a verbal offer to purchase at that point in time. It's just written down, and because it hasn't been signed. But again, this is some recommendation that the North Carolina Association of Realtors has provided. Or option B for that is you would send Form 220, again, separate, same email, but separate documents, and the signed offer to purchase with language somewhere in the body of the email stating that the offer is contingent on seller's acceptance of compensation in Form 220. And that you will want to work with legal counsel on exactly what will cover your the language in there is covering that it makes it contingent on the acceptance of the Form 220. So again, there's been guidance from the North Carolina Association of Realtors that this would be an acceptable way when you are worried about the seller signing an offer to purchase without signing the Form 220. Because in theory, you could send over the offer to purchase, and everybody accepts that, and now you have a fully signed document, but you don't have a fully signed 220 saying you're going to get paid on that.
Right, exactly. So these are some, as Chris said, ways to address that.
Yeah,
and
so we got really deep into the weeds there on those last couple scenarios, and we feel like those are just some of the ways that you're going to see stuff go down as we move forward. And again, this is as of August 23rd, I think we're recording this video.
Yeah.
This could change next week, and we just put all this time into this for funsies. But I'm confident that all of those scenarios follow license law, as well as being compliant with any NAR ethics, as
And the
well
settlement.
as and the settlement and guidance by the North Carolina Association of Realtors. So yeah, so we thank you for watching. Hopefully you got some good stuff out of this. Diane, did you have any parting words that you wanted to add as well?
No, we hope that it's helpful for you and gives you a little more roadmap and some visuals and some ways to, move forward and go through our new world. Every time I say new world, I feel like I want to sing Aladdin, but anyway. All right, but that's it. That's all we got.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Hope you got some good stuff. And if you need any help, just don't say Chris or Diane told us to do it this way.
Do not.
Your BIC and your firm are ultimately, and your broker are ultimately the ones who are going to tell you what to do. This is just in lieu of having that, or you feel like you may be out of that. This is just what we put together for you. So thank you, and hope you learned something.
Thanks.